On the 27th of July 1890, in a peaceful village in the north of France, Vincent van Gogh tragically died under mysterious circumstances just 1 year after painting his iconic masterpiece, Starry Night. It was the sad and dramatic climax after many years of mental suffering that even included a 1-year stay in a mental asylum, as well as the horrible act of cutting his own left ear. Van Gogh himself gave voice to the tragic conditions of his life with the words, "I put my heart and my soul into my work and lost my mind in the process." Apart from Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, there are probably just a handful of paintings that are known to almost anyone on the planet. One such artistic masterpiece is The Scream by Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, which was sold for the astonishing price of nearly $120 million in 2012. While the painting depicts an immensely tormented individual surrounded by a bleeding sky, Munch himself was also haunted by malevolent inner demons that led to psychotic states consisting of hallucinations and extreme paranoia. In the fall of 1908, he was eventually admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Copenhagen. But Van Gogh and Munch are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the co-occurrence of creative genius and mental madness. Over the course of history until this day, countless gifted individuals have wrestled with the mental misery, and for many, it has ended tragically. But this is not some phenomenon limited to the chosen few geniuses among us, but can rather affect any person during their creative endeavors. Just like Van Gogh or Munch, complete darkness can engulf us all on the creative path and give rise to inner demons tormenting our psyche. To shed light on this dreadful darkness, we will explore Friedrich Nietzsche's ambivalent view of the suffering creative individual and look at relevant psychological research regarding 3 pathologies often associated with creativity: substance abuse, depression, and schizophrenia. It is in the combination of these 2 great disciplines, namely philosophy and psychology, that we may find a better understanding of the deep-lying roots of the tragic creative individual who can easily be anyone among us. Creation. That is the great redemption from all suffering and life's growing light. But that the creator may be, suffering is needed. Nietzsche's contradictory conception of creativity and the creative individual is perfectly encapsulated in this short quote from his famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So according to his view, the creative process can be the antidote to life's suffering, while it will also entail great suffering for the creative individual, and with this suffering even being a necessary component of that creative process. What may sound slightly confusing is actually a brilliant and thought-provoking idea by this great German philosopher. As suffering is at the center of Nietzsche's argument about creativity, it is crucial to know that his conception of suffering was heavily influenced by his extremely upbeat compatriot and pessimism expert Arthur Schopenhauer. According to Schopenhauer, one's suffering stems from the inescapable perception of lacking something, which then leads to immense pain. Now, as being in pain isn't really nice, a desire to overcome that predicament is born within oneself. This is where Nietzsche's view on suffering diverges from Schopenhauer's. Our notorious pessimist Schopenhauer believed that any effort to fulfill a desire is futile, as it would only breed new desires, so we are bound to experience a never-ending stream of lack and hence a never-ending stream of desires, which constitutes an endless cycle of frustration and suffering. Permanent fulfillment is therefore impossible, which led Schopenhauer to propose detachment and resignation concerning one's own desires. But you see, the idea of resignation isn't very popular in Nietzsche's dictionary. Not only that, he perceived resignation as a sign of weakness, and weakness is, according to him, one of the greatest hazards in the world. By that, I don't necessarily mean physical weakness, but rather the cowardice weakness towards life's spicy flavors that represent the hardships and challenges one has to face. It is facing those metaphorical dragons that stand in one's way, as famous psychologist Carl Jung would have probably put it. This fight against dragons is accurately described by the word resistance. So winning the fight against a dragon would equate to overcoming resistance, and that requires walking on the dangerous and hostile path towards that which one desires. Nietzsche explains the path to one's heaven always leads through the voluptuousness of one's own hell. So the path to overcoming one's suffering is a path through burning hell, which obviously entails immense suffering. And while Schopenhauer proposed to resign in the face of the dragon and never take that path at all, Nietzsche believed it is the essence of life and an antidote to nihilism if one constantly seeks out and walks such paths, thus repeatedly overcoming dragons. Now, walking the same dangerous path would quickly become predictable and lead to reduced suffering. This is why Nietzsche, staying true to his brilliant philosophy, emphasized the necessity of always seeking out unknown paths where new dragons await. This is nicely illustrated by an excerpt of The Gay Science where he wrote, "Live dangerously. Send your ships into uncharted seas." This analogy perfectly depicts the tormenting predicament of the creative individual. Like the adventurers of all times, it is the creative person more than any other that constantly and voluntarily sails out towards the dark waters of uncertainty, where the tormenting terror awaits. And Nietzsche thought that precisely this voluntariness of repeatedly seeking out the dreadful darkness of uncertainty makes the creative individual the utmost incarnation of strength, and creativity the gold standard for the will to power. However, a tremendous price must be paid, which is a life of constant and insane suffering, while facing all those monsters that await at the dark horizon that the creative individual approaches courageously. Some pay this price with their mental health, their own sanity, and even their lives. But what exactly is it about the creative process that entails so much suffering? As one could argue, painting hardly seems to be wearing someone down towards severe mental health issues. Far from it. Painting is even used as part of art therapy to support the healing of psychological disorders. So where is the severe suffering Nietzsche was making all the fuss about? Well, it is not the mechanical production of creative artworks that contain the suffering, but rather the state of psychological uncertainty that the creative individual experiences while slowly being engulfed by the darkness. Seneca wrote the following famous line: "The whole future lies in uncertainty." Being uncertain of what might happen in our lives is a distinctively human trait, and it has accompanied us since the emergence of consciousness, and with it our ability to ponder about possible future events. But while we all have to deal with some amount of uncertainty in our lives, it is omnipresent and especially severe within the existence of the creative individual. I mean, think about it. Creating something that merits the label of creative accomplishment translates towards sailing into the unknown, where intense feelings of uncertainty lurk within the depths of darkness. There is no concrete map from which one can easily navigate in those waters, and this relates not only to the creative process itself, but also to how the artistic work may be judged by others, as well as the self-critical creator himself. Now, even if you are just engaging in a creative activity as part of a hobby with lofty ambitions, you may be plagued by feelings of uncertainty. But imagine how this would amplify if your financial livelihood, social recognition, and self-esteem depend on your creative accomplishments. These are the high stakes with which professional artists sail into the depths of darkness on a regular basis. This is when the uncomfortable state of uncertainty can breed another much bigger and more terrifying monster that can inflict enormous suffering and pain upon one's psyche. This gigantic monster is anxiety, and it is, as we will see now, not only associated with three pathologies often tormenting creative individuals: substance abuse, depression, and schizophrenia, but this monster may also be responsible for neural degeneration in the brain. In recent years, there has been quite some neuroscientific research conducted to uncover the neurocircuitry within the brain on how uncertainty may breed anxiety. While the findings are far from conclusive, as is usually the case in science, some brain areas have been identified to play a rather dominant role. These are the amygdala, a prominent part of the limbic system and historically associated with anxiety disorders. Heightened amygdala activation has been observed in anxious individuals who are expecting to deliver a public speech. Then there is the orbitofrontal cortex, a part of the prefrontal cortex which kind of sits transverse behind the eyes. It is associated with decision-making processes and the evaluation of future scenarios. And also worth mentioning is the anterior insula, which is crucially involved in the anticipation of negative events. Now, as creative individuals suffer from severe uncertainty and therefore anxiety on a regular basis, the question arises, what kind of toll this constant suffering may take on the brain and the psyche? Judged from a neuroscientific perspective, the toll on the brain is serious. Researchers found that regular anxiety may lead to neural decay in the prefrontal cortex as well as the hippocampus, what can increase one's risk for neuropsychiatric disorders. Now, this is a very crucial finding as it indicates that creative individuals or frequently anxious people may actually suffer physiological destruction within the brain as a consequence of their uncertainty. Now, so much for the neurocircuitry of the brain. What are the effects on one's psyche? Well, it turns out the psychological harm of anxiety evoked by uncertainty is highly frightening and severe. While entire books could be written on this topic, we will briefly look at 3 psychological disorders that are commonly associated with creative individuals. First, there is depression. Van Gogh famously wrote, "The sadness will last forever." These words give further weight to the image of the melancholic artist who has such a hard time finding profound joy in life. While the causes for depression can be manifold, anxiety elicited by uncertainty may likely be one such cause, or to be more concrete, a certain element of uncertainty, which is the perceived uncontrollability regarding one's future. Both pathologically anxious and depressed people often report a sense of helplessness that stems from the perceived uncontrollability of their future. This may also be part of the explanation why scientists and clinicians alike have frequently reported a high co-occurrence of anxiety and depression. Now, as if anxiety and depression are not already blending into a poisonous cocktail, the psychological suffering for the creative individual does not stop here. Another terrifying monster looms on the horizon, surrounded by the darkness of uncertainty. That monster is schizophrenia, and in the eyes of many scientists, it is associated with creativity. Both our 2 resident artists have severely suffered from psychotic symptoms, which are also typical of schizophrenia, with the most prominent symptoms being delusions of persecution and hallucinations, which may partly explain why on earth Van Gogh came up with the original idea to cut off his own left ear. Even though hallucinations may contribute to increased creativity, they can also be highly terrifying for the individual experiencing them and lead to disastrous actions, as seen by Van Gogh's example. While our understanding of schizophrenia is still not sufficient to clearly pin down the origins of such psychotic symptoms, there is quite some research linking them to anxiety and even discussing the possibility of anxiety being a causal factor of those symptoms typical for schizophrenia. So following this train of thought, anxiety may be an important factor in the emergence of hallucinations and delusions of persecution. Both Van Gogh and Munch tick the boxes here as they both suffered from intense anxiety as well as the mentioned psychotic symptoms. Now, assumptions about causality must always be treated with utmost caution, but this may still explain the close relationship of anxiety and schizophrenic symptoms and just illuminate the terrifying destinations one dark uncertainty can lead to. So, uncertainty, anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and paranoia. Can it get any worse for our beloved creative individuals? Well, unfortunately it can, and paradoxically, the next source of suffering we will focus on is often sought out to reduce one's suffering, albeit just temporarily. For this very reason, some would argue that it is the most dangerous monster, promising a way out, but slowly and eventually dragging one into the abyss until one's entire self is absorbed by the darkness. The monster I'm speaking about are addictive substances that are taken to numb one's suffering but can easily lead to an amplification of the suffering. As this monster is so vast, we will only look at one prominent shape it can take: alcohol. Many of us have reached for a glass in times of uncertainty and anxiety. It is the magical elixir that can make us more carefree, more social, and more relaxed with all the chaos going on around us. Now, as we have discussed, creative individuals are dealing with a lot of uncertainty in their lives, and hence, it comes with little surprise that the drinking genius artist is a historically prominent figure. Both Van Gogh and Munch were no exception to this, as they drank excessively. Perhaps their drinking was related to their high levels of anxiety induced by the uncertain nature of the creative profession. Alcohol may have been their way of quieting their anxiety in the midst of the dark uncertainty and hence ease their suffering. And at first glance, this is actually a very potent strategy, as alcohol can indeed relieve one from feelings of anxiety, as many of us have probably experienced firsthand. But while it is highly effective to counter anxiety in the short term, it can immensely increase one's anxiety after regular consumption, and thus gradually strengthen the monster it was actually supposed to fight off. To better understand the somewhat paradoxical relationship of alcohol and anxiety, we will now open up the brain to look at the neuroscience behind this paradox. At the center of our attention are the prominent neurotransmitters GABA, which stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, and glutamate, with both having roughly opposite functions within the brain. While GABA is the most important inhibitory neurotransmitter, glutamate is the most important excitatory one. So, anxiety is associated with decreased inhibition by GABA and heightened excitation by glutamate in relevant brain regions, like for example the amygdala. Considering this, we could argue that creative individuals who suffer under regular uncertainty have therefore probably less than average inhibition by GABA and more than average excitation by glutamate, which contributes to the anxious feelings. But now comes the popular hero alcohol to the rescue by increasing the inhibitory effects of GABA and reducing the excitatory effects of glutamate, hence leading to the alleviation of feelings of anxiety and therefore reducing the suffering. The brain literally calms down on a neurophysiological level. But this is not the end of the story, as an important brain mechanism enters the scene: neurophysiological adaptation. The heightened neural inhibition and lowered excitation because of regular alcohol consumption are met by the brain with neurophysiological adaptation, which entails a reduction of GABA receptors to slow down its inhibitory effects and an amplification of glutamate sensitivity to facilitate its excitatory effects. It is basically the brain saying, hey, as you are getting all these relaxing effects from your magical external elixir, I'm gonna adapt my neural structure so you don't tranquilize yourself to death. What is a reasonable reaction from the brain has actually two major disastrous consequences for the person. One, the person gradually develops more tolerance to the tranquilizing effects of alcohol, as the lower amounts of GABA receptors and heightened glutamate sensitivity in the brain hamper those effects. The usual reaction of many Homo sapiens is to just drink more booze to reach the same effects. The second disastrous consequence of the brain's neurophysiological adaptation concerns the person's anxiety. We remember that anxiety is associated with decreased inhibition by GABA and heightened excitation by glutamate in relevant brain regions, like for example the amygdala. Now, due to the neurophysiological adaptation as a result to the alcohol consumption, there is even less inhibitory potential by GABA and even more heightened excitation potential by glutamate, what results in a much more anxiety-friendly brain environment. So the monster with the name of anxiety, which was supposed to be weakened by the consumption of alcohol, got actually much more big and powerful in the process. This can leave the person trapped in a vicious cycle consisting of more alcohol, more tolerance, more anxiety, and again more alcohol, and so on, until one is totally absorbed by the darkness. This is what might have happened to Van Gogh and Munch and countless other creative individuals from the past or present. By turning to substances like alcohol and thus trying to fight off the uncomfortable feelings of uncertainty, they bred a monster so gigantic that eventually cost them their sanity, or to repeat Van Gogh's tragic words, I put my heart and my soul into my work and lost my mind in the process. So what can we make of all this depressing information? Are creative individuals just doomed to suffer endlessly? Well, I don't know if there is a definitive answer to that, but what I know for sure is that creativity is not merely a nice to have, but rather a necessity. even if it means to sail into the darkest unknown waters filled by hostile monsters, because in the midst of the darkest darkness, there may occur, even if only briefly, a light brighter than many of us can imagine, a light so powerful that for a brief moment, all darkness is pushed back. For a brief moment, all suffering is conquered, and for that brief moment, the joyful soul of the creative individual can shine through. It is the very light that we may also experience when we look at a nice piece of art, or read a beautifully written book, or watch a mesmerizing acting performance, or use the newest innovation. And this may be precisely what the creative individual had intended, to share with others that bright light they have within themselves, even if it required them to sail into the darkest abyss. In the case of Van Gogh, it is especially tragic, as he was never able to experience how others were affected by the beauty he produced through all the suffering he endured. If only he could have known how much light he brought to the world with his art. Because if there's one thing we can definitely do, it is to appreciate the suffering and hardships creative individuals take on themselves. They spent most of their time in the darkness to brighten up our world. Nietzsche fittingly wrote that creation is life's growing light. So this goes to the suffering artist who does not know whether anyone will watch their works, to the self-doubting writer who stares at those daunting blank pages, to the laughed-at entrepreneur who works on the next innovation, and most importantly, to the little creative and carefree child within all of us. Let's continue to bravely sail into the darkness and light this roaring place up.